Sheila rather than myself. I'm not used to getting such friendly welcome, certainly in some of the Facebook arenas that I've inhabited over the past few years. Good morning, everyone. Could I ask anyone who's at the back to just move in and take seats? There's quite a few spare seats around if you'd like to take seats. Can you hear me okay? Is everybody yes?
You've been a bit louder.
What's the matter, Jodie?
I said it could have been a bit louder.
Oh, a bit louder?
Yeah.
No problem. We're here to be a little bit louder. We're here not just to think differently, but also to speak our truths, and we do that with the fullness of our voice and our lung capacity, so very happy to be a little bit louder. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Conway Hall. Very delighted to be up here on the stage at Conway Hall with all of you here. It's taken us a few long years to get here. Some of you may be aware there's a certain unhappy history that we've had with this venue, but I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to be opening this event today. So we've had a couple of little technical hitches. I had a lovely slide all prepared, a nice wallpaper slide with the conference, which I was determined to get up there, but it's not worked. So this means that we're a little bit late getting started, so I'm really going to limit my opening remarks to just to some housekeeping, so I'm sure you will be pleased about that. I won't rambling on too long. What I do want to say in particular is a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm really, really pleased that so many of you have been able to attend. Particularly warm, appreciative welcome to all those of you who've travelled from overseas to get here. Absolutely bowled over by that. Particularly our speakers who travelled from the States, some of you other participants I know have come over from the States, from Germany, from France, anywhere else? From Hungary. France, I said France. Australia. Oh, Australia! To all of you. We just had a little 10-minute taxi ride here, so it was easier for some of us than others. There are a lot of people to thank. Because we want to get on with things, I'm going to thank everyone at the end. So, but just to say, very appreciative to everyone who's contributed to making sure this event goes ahead. So I think we'll just crack on with things. Just to say, we've been really pleased that we had a little bit of publicity for the event in the London Standard yesterday. So some of you might have seen that. It was, I thought, quite a fair account of some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So that was pleasing to see that. There is a hashtag for the event, which is hashtag Thinking Differently. If you want to tweet on that, those of you who are into that kind of thing. All I would say is that I hope that by the end of the day, some of us are maybe not just feeling that we can think differently, but we can also speak differently and act on what we think and what we speak as well. So I'm really On that note, it gives me huge pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Sheila Jeffreys. I think, I know you will all join me in expressing our huge appreciation and gratitude for all that we've learned and benefited from Sheila's scholarship over the years, and I would say particularly in relation to this issue where there has been a kind of deafening silence from from a lot of feminist scholars and even activists on this issue for quite a number of years. And I think when Sheila's book came out, was it the year before last? I think it was 2014. I really think that was a huge milestone in terms of bringing people up to speed with what the politics of transgenderism and gender identity, etc. So I'll stop blethering on about how to say here for yourself. She was going to be talking on the social and political construction of transgenderism. So thank you.
like it, where a critical feminist analysis of transgenderism has been publicly expressed for a whole day in this way. So this is the beginning, in a way. I know a lot's been going on, but it's really quite historic. Now, some of you who read The Guardian will be aware that the middle of this last week, there were 3 pages of The Guardian devoted to the huge increase in the demand for transgender treatments at gender identity clinics in the UK. For instance, several of the 14 clinics have had increases in recent years of several 100%. The Tavistock Institute for Children has had referrals in the past year of 100% increase. Now, quite apart from the strain that the creation of this invented problem creates for the NHS, and I'm sure a lot of you in this room will be very aware of the strains on the NHS at the moment, quite apart from that difficulty, there is no criticism really either of that or of what's happening anyway. The Guardian articles had no critical commentary at all. There was no sociological perspective, no political perspective, no mention that any feminist disagreed with what was happening. Absolutely nothing. So that is not a responsible approach by the media, but it is the general response by the media. There's absolutely no criticism out there. There's no suggestion, for instance, that transgenderism could be a social contagion produced through the internet, through the sending of educators into schools to teach transgenderism and to make children transgender and so on. There's no suggestion there were any social influences on what was happening here. Now, I will suggest now, today, that transgenderism is indeed an invention, that is socially and politically constructed, and the present contagion is a result of forces of power in a heteropatriarchal society, rather than related in any way to an innate and transhistorical condition. For instance, those who believe that there has always been transgenders or transsexuals in history would say there have always been transgender children historically. Actually, I don't think so. There have not. Okay? But there are, supposedly, now. Now, as transgenderism grows as a social contagion, the many social harms associated with it, from conflict with women's rights to the conversion of young lesbians and gay men to surgically constructed heterosexuality, to serious health problems created by the treatment, and many others. All of these increase, as we shall see through the other contributions at this conference. Now, the ideology of transgenderism is, most importantly, that persons who transgender are essentially endowed with mental and behavioural characteristics more suitable to someone of the opposite sex. The men, for instance, are seen as having women's brains in biologically male bodies and to possess a feminine essence. They don't like the critical analysis of where transgenderism comes from, the idea that it is constructed, and we can look at that, because it undermines the essentialness of their condition. And the legislative and policy gains they've made, which endanger women's rights and threaten to disappear women as biologically female persons, they're all based upon this ideology of essentialness. So it's important that people who say the sort of thing I'm going to say today cannot be heard. To support the ideology, they argue there have always been transgenders in history and definitely reject social constructionism. Now, the concept of transgenderism was, the anthropologist David Valentine in the US says, institutionalized in the 1990s. Before that, the term was not really used, nobody was really aware of it. And the term and the concept has to be out there for people to identify with it. If it doesn't exist, then it's not possible really to have transgenders. Valentine is an anthropologist who did research on communities in New York in the mid-1990s that were identified to him as transgender by the AIDS outreach organisation he worked for. And he was surprised to discover that none of those in these supposedly transgender communities identified themselves as transgender. or had any idea about the term. So the social services and NGOs got it first. They picked up that ideology and they were going onto the street to promote it and try to identify their clients. Right? So that's how things get institutionalized. He found that the men on the strolls that he was directed to find the transgender communities were gay men involved in prostitution. They adopted attire more normally associated with women, but they were happy to identify as men and as gay. They wanted to keep their penises and were very fond of them, and so on. So they were unaware of the concept of transgenderism. They wouldn't be now. They're not caught up with the new language, and they're not caught up with the new categorization. There was a time lag between the voices of authority that were constructing transgenderism and it's reaching its targets, right? Which is really fascinating. Now, I'll just say very briefly, of course, and I'm sure you really know this, there is a difference between sex and gender. Transgender activists believe, or pretend to believe, for tactical purposes, that gender exists as an essence in human beings, and they determinedly confuse gender with biological sex, but actually biological sex is an inconvenient truth because it can't be altered. Transgenders can only trans the superficial behavioural traits and appearance norms that they identify as belonging to one biological sex or another. Now the terms transsexual and transgender. The term transsexual was coined in the 1950s to describe those persons who wish to change their sex, as it was understood really at the time. And the term was popularised by the endocrinologist Harry Benjamin in his book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, 1966. It's important he's an endocrinologist. Many of those involved in the construction of transgenderism are from the drugs industry, because of course the persons identified as transgender, transsexual, then transgender have to take these drugs for the rest of their lives, and I'm sure you're aware lots of women came off HRT when they discovered how harmful it was, so it was necessary to have replacements. Big drug companies have to have replacements as the dangers and the harms of the drugs they're currently peddling become obvious. Okay? So putting huge numbers of children and adults on these drugs for the rest of their lives is a very, very important source of profit, and indeed the drug industry companies fund the so-called Transgender Health Organisation, internationally WPATH. You would go onto that site, you'll see the huge amounts of money coming from all the major drug companies into it. It's a massive source of profit for them. So at that time in the 1960s, there was generally this distinction made between cross-dressers or transvestites, who are men who are sexually excited by wearing clothing they associate with women, and engaging in masochistic fantasies about themselves as the subordinate sex, and men who actually impersonated the opposite sex and required social recognition of themselves as women. So transvestites were seen as separate from transsexuals, and indeed the Beaumont Society in Britain was for transvestites, and they didn't want transsexuals in there and so on. So there was lots of boundary keeping. That's all fallen away now, of course. The term transgender was coined by a heterosexual cross-dresser in the States called Virginia Prince in the 1960s, and he sought to distinguish himself from transsexuals and thought men wanting to cut their penises off was sadly mistaken. So he lived as a woman all of his life, but he never actually thought he was one, and he didn't have his penis removed. He started a magazine, he lived as a woman all of his life after his 2 marriages and so on. He started a magazine in the US for cross-dressers in 1960 called Transvestia. So we have to remember, and I'll say a little bit more about this, about the role of the social movement of cross-dressers as one of the social and political forces that has constructed transgenderism. He worked to create a more acceptable face for cross-dressing, a practice previously understood as a paraphilia, a form of sexual fetishism. So Virginia Prince tried to normalise that through his movement and his magazine and so on. And when you look at the magazines, and I have from the 1960s, it's extremely similar to what you see in terms of the stories of cross-dressers and transgenders online now. There's virtually no whisker of difference between the way that this is put across. It's very, very fascinating. Now, his adoption of the term was part of what I'll call here the move to gender, in which both cross-dressing and transsexualism came to be understood as expressions of an internal or essential gender, rather than simply being hobbies carried out for sexual excitement. The term transgender was then normalised through the queer politics of the 1990s, when it was adopted to convey a wide meaning, encompassing all those who were seen as engaging in behaviour was usually allotted to the opposite sex. So it came to include butch lesbians, cross-dressers, gay men, prostituted men, and so on. Presently, the term transgender is used in common parlance to refer to those who would once have been called transsexual most commonly. But the distinctions have really broken down now. Now, in history, transgenderism in history, because remember the ideology is there have always been transgenders in history, it was an essential condition. What transgender activists do is seek to appropriate persons in history who might have worn the clothing of the opposite sex and say they're really transgenders. The problem with that is that they're mostly lesbians and gay men who have an honoured part in lesbian and gay history, because a lot of lesbians and gay men have historically tended to wear items of clothing of the opposite sex. So a bit of a turf war there, because transgender activists are seeking to appropriate lesbians and gays from lesbian and gay history. In fact, women cross-dressed historically because they didn't want to be maids or prostitutes. They wanted to be able to be pirates and in the military and plumbers and so on. They sometimes cross-dressed because they wanted to be able to have relationships with women without social opprobrium. So there are many reasons for cross-dressing which do not include thinking that they were transgender, a concept which did not really exist. So transgenderism does not have some essential presence in history. Until transgenderism, the main force in creating transgenderism, the category, is sexology, the science of sex. Now, in the late 19th century, faith in God as the arbiter of all things sexual was declining. There were all these children in London in the mid-19th century who didn't even know who Jesus was. This was a cause of concern to some. And therefore, there needed to be a new regulatory authority for sexual practice, instead of people having to be taken to the church courts or whatever. And the regulatory authority was sexologists or the scientists of sex. There were medical men who expanded their remit to become pundits on correct sexual behaviour. There were traditional men who believed that men should be men and women should be women. For instance, they sought to explain homosexuality through a notion that it was a biological condition in which, by some mysterious fashion, the brain of a woman had occupied the body of a man and vice versa. This will be sounding familiar, probably, in terms of transgenderism. And indeed, it's the first manifestation of this kind of ideology from an authoritative medical source. So that's in the late 19th, early 20th century. They didn't clearly distinguish homosexuality from what would be later understood as transvestism, transsexualism, or transgenderism at that time. They did understand these persons, these homosexual persons, as biologically constructed. They had congenital abnormality, and so on. For instance, the sexologist Hadrogenes did say that lesbians are able to whistle and gay men unable to whistle because this is biological. And I think it was that lesbians like the colour purple and gay men like the colour green, biological, and so on. And also handwriting, he was very keen on handwriting. You could tell from the handwriting whether the person had the brain of the wrong sex in the wrong body and so on. And they described it as being about sort of germs, sexual germs. They didn't know about hormones or chromosomes or genes or any of those things at the time. But they thought in homosexual something goes wrong with the process and ends up with a person who's more fitted for the exercise of the inverted than the normal sexual impulse, says Hadrogenes. Now, these sexologists had no way at that time of making the sexual inverts, as they called them, into members of the opposite sex physically. They didn't have the hormones, they didn't have the surgeries at that time. That wasn't until the 1920s they began to be developed, and you will know of the case of Einar Wegener, also known as the Danish girl. There's a movie about him. He was a cross-dresser who was then subjected to these treatments. And he was killed by a uterus transplant in 1931. The surgeries were a little bit primitive at that time, so he was one of the early casualties. He's now been claimed as the hero of the transgender movement, instead of the unfortunate victim of gruesome medical experiments to create surgically constructed heterosexuality, because he then went on to re-elect men. Now, so I'm going to argue that the category of transgender is indeed constructed by forces of male power. Let's look more closely at medicine in the construction of transgenderism. This only became thinkable, the idea of transgenderism as we now understand it, as a result of developments in medicine in the 20th century. Endocrinology was crucial because it enabled the creation of artificial hormones. They started off by doing things like planting doped testicles into people, all sorts of experiments going on in the 20s, and then they developed the possibility of using artificial hormones. And Bernice Hausmann has a wonderful book on this, looking at how public dissemination being the right word in that context, of scientific knowledge of the human endocrine system enables certain human subjects to understand themselves as members of the other sex. So they couldn't understand themselves as members of the other sex until the possibilities and the categories had actually been created that they could identify with and seek to enter. So endocrinology created the artificial hormones, and then another very important thing is plastic surgery, which enabled actually to do the operations, and anaesthesia, which enabled those operations to be conducted. So those three medical specialisms were crucial to the construction of what we have now. Now, the development of these medical specialisms was so important to the construction of transgenderism that the historian of sexuality, Vern Bullock, comments that he once presented a paper in 1973 suggesting that transsexualism might be iatrogenic. That is a health problem created by medicine itself. In fact, there were more critics in the 1970s than there are now. But we've gone back historically a very long way in relation to gender and sexuality today, as I'm sure all of you are really, really aware. Now, the idea of transsexualism as a condition which required treatment by hormones and surgery was not well accepted in the early years. In fact, when the first famous transsexual in the US, Christine Jorgensen, went public with his experience in the 1950s, there was a turf war in the medical profession about the correct treatment. A turf war between those who dealt with the mind and considered the fantasy of being a woman would be best treated by psychotherapy, and surgery was a mutilation, they thought, and those who were endocrinologists and surgeons who considered the best treatment was physical, i.e. altering the body, even though the problem was actually in the mind. Now, the male demanders of transgender treatment have been very important as a social and political force. Once the category was there and the treatment possibilities were there, demanders developed and created a movement that demanded this treatment. The men fell into two categories: homosexual men who felt unable to love men while remaining a male body, and men who were overwhelmingly heterosexual and transgender as a climax to their interest in cross-dressing. Christine Jorgensen was in the first category. He was a gay man, but persuaded by his doctors in the 1950s he was really a woman. Homosexual men are a minority of those who transgender, men who transgender today. The majority category of demanders derives from male, ostensibly heterosexual cross-dressers. And though cross-dressing is a fairly common pursuit of heterosexual men, probably quite a few of us in this room have had boyfriends or men they knew who liked dressing up in bits of women's clothing. We can talk about that later. So it's quite common. It's actually quite common. It's from this constituency the term transgender arose, the cross-dressers. The cross-dressers movement itself, as I mentioned, Virginia Price was involved in creating a movement, the demanders movement created of cross-dressers, cross-dressers groups were formed all over the States and in the UK. And this early movement didn't have access to the internet, but they campaigned for acceptance through their groups and magazines. Now they have the internet. It's a whole different scale of demand and social movement and what is going on. Now, the move to gender. The construction of the idea of gender was necessary in order to justify and explain sex change treatment. Now, some of you will probably be very aware that feminists have used the term gender. Not me, but socialist feminists in particular, back in the late 1970s, particularly in the Women in International Development movement, used the term gender, and they said it could represent the fact that there was inequality and that it was about the struggle between men and women. It was about political struggle. Unfortunately, that understanding has fallen away, and I would advise you to drop the term gender. I think we need to eliminate it from our vocabulary as feminists. We need to talk about sex class or sex caste, choose your terms, but gender is completely meaningless. It's now understood to be biological, and in the way that it's being used presently against us, it's a very serious problem. The sex change surgery was predicated on the notion of gender as created by the sexologists. It was about the idea of an identity prior to and within the body that theoretically should dictate the physical appearance of the subject. That's how she describes it. So it was developed by John Money and other sexologists in the 1960s and 70s. Houseman calls the doctors the gender managers, and she says that opposition to homosexuality fueled their work. So hatred of homosexuality has been fundamental to the medical construction of transgenderism from the 1960s onward. I think it's fair to still strongly there, and many are prepared to call transgenderism a form of conversion therapy when it is applied to children today. Sorry?
Well said.
Okay. Now, autogynephilia. I need to say a bit more about what underlies the interests of the majority of men who are heterosexual who become demanders of transsexual treatment. There is a grouping of sexologists today who argue the majority form amongst males should be understood as something called autogynephilia, love of the woman in yourself. They say it's a sexual interest, or paraphilia, as transvestism has always been understood to be. Their characterization of the practice offers an insight into the importance attached by some men who transgender or cross-dress to appearing in public, to women in toilets, for instance, and seeking a reaction from them. This is a common aspect of autogynephilia. For instance, the sexologists Bailey and Trier argue, and they describe it as the erotic fantasy of being admired in the female persona by another person, preferably by a woman, in fact, if they're going into the women's toilets. Ray Blanchard explains that a signal difference between autogynephiles and homosexuals, to whom they're often compared, is that homosexuals do not seek a reaction from passers-by for their sexual satisfaction. In fact, they're probably going to do whatever they want to do somewhere probably. Whereas, in fact, heterosexual men who progress from cross-dressing to transgenderism act as if they're in a perpetual movie into which other persons, such as wives, are inducted, however unwillingly, to play the part of the audience. So that audience, again, is crucial to the practice and the sexual satisfactions of the practice. Though an increasing number of sexologists are saying that cross-dressing and autogynephile transsexualism are based on a sexual orientation, i.e. paraphilia, rather than misplaced gender, they still don't venture to explain exactly what the sexual excitement is based upon. But the sexologists, and I would argue that this sexual interest is a form of masochism. And there's one fascinating statistic. They say of men who die practicing the dangerous masochistic activity of autoerotic asphyxia, approximately 24% are cross-dressed. Fascinating. So what is the excitement? The excitement is that women are in a subordinate class, and therefore wearing the clothing of the subordinate class has the sexual excitement of masochism. And as we shall see this afternoon when I'm talking about the pornography of transgenderism, it's that status reduction that is crucially sexually exciting. Now, Blanchard and his supporters argue there's plenty of evidence of the existence of autogynephilia, whereas there's none of feminine essence. And the evidence lies in the narrative that Blanchard and the transgender psychologist Anne Lawrence have collected. Blanchard offers some examples from Lawrence's collection to show how it manifests itself. One narrative describes the author's sexual excitement of being taken for a woman. In the early days, I would become aroused whenever anyone, a sales clerk, a casual stranger, would address me as man, or perform some courtesy, such as holding a door open for me. It's just like any other woman's experience, isn't it, really? Another explains that both before and after sexually assignment surgery, he liked to pretend to menstruate. It was and still is sexually exciting for me to have female body functions. Before my SRS, I would pretend to menstruate by urinating in sanitary pads. I particularly enjoyed wearing the old-fashioned belted pad with long tabs. Now, the motivations of ostensibly heterosexual men who are transgender are fairly well explained by these sexologists, as I say, as emerging from a form of masochism and sexual excitement. Now, another force in the construction of transgenderism today is the way in which the development of the internet has enabled groups of mainly men to create online communities around their sexual proclivities. And this happened in relation to cross-dressing and transgenderism, but also in relation to another practice which has some close connections with transgenderism, transableism. The example of transableism shows how identity can be built online, but it also shows the problems of this kind of identity politics in which categories of persons who suffer disadvantage, in the case of transableism, persons with disabilities, can be the subject of appropriation and imitation for sexual excitement, using the justification that an identity, however peculiar, should be respected. In this practice, which was originally called apatendophilia, is now more usually called body identity integrity disorder, aspirants, for instance, seek amputation of one or more limbs. But there are actually varieties of this practice in which men seek to be completely disabled. Some of them said they would like to have their backs broken, and so on. And the aspirants are busy online creating identities. The main sexologist who is supporting all of this is Michael First, editor of the US Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. He's been advocating for this practice, BIID, to be added to the DSM, the Psychologist's Bible, so that those seeking amputation of legs can get treatment or arms. He argues that transagents in general should be placed in the manual under the heading of identity disorder, which includes only two categories: gender identity disorder and BIID. He also points out in his research that very often there are men who have expressed both of these things. And one of these is, of course, Chloe Jennings Wright. There was he was featured in an episode of National Geographic's Taboo series. Jennings Wright is a man who has transgendered, and he chooses to live as a paraplegic in a wheelchair. He doesn't have a disability, but he does get respectful attention, and no one is rude to say that not only does he not have a disability, but he's also not a woman but a man. Nobody says that last bit. They try to sort of accept that he's a woman with a disability. There are also online communities which adhere to stranger identities than these, including trans speciesists who see themselves as wild animals, or most usually wolves, because wolves are seen as sort of, a bit butch, I think. Everyone wants to be a wolf, they don't want to be heroes. Clever fly. There are also trans speciesists who see themselves, trans ethnicists who see themselves as different ethnicities. For instance, there's a woman who sees herself as a Korean cat, and that's got both of those fantasies in there. But these are not seen as worthy of serious attention in the way that transgenderism is, because gender is seen somehow as real and significant, and whereas the desire for fur or horns is not. Right? That is seen as something quite separate, although sometimes I think we should try and work out why gender is seen as this thing you could just fantasize about and adopt. Whereas the rest is not. Now I know I have to go fairly quickly, so another force in the construction of transgenderism is queer politics in the 1990s. Queer politics said that gender was something that you could transmute or cross over or do anything you liked with, you could play with gender, and so on and so on. Very different to early feminists in the 1960s and 70s who did not say that. For instance, Robin Morgan in 1973 said, "We know what's at work when whites wear blackface. The same thing is at work when men wear drag." So feminists like Robin Morgan were really clear. In the 1990s, all of this became very, very vague. I think queer politics and postmodernism in queering the possibility of even being a woman, disappearing the importance of biology and so on, have a big part to play in the construction of transgenderism. Men who transgender are now seeking to actually construct feminism in their image. Men like Julia Serrano, who wrote the book Whipping Girl. He says that he doesn't say he was born transgender, he says at the age of 11 he was attracted to curtains. He says it wasn't until the age of 11 that I consciously recognised his subconscious feelings as an urge or desire to be female. I found myself inexplicably compelled to remove a set of white curtains from the window and wrap them around my body like a dress. Right? Women here probably got that sort of experience. I thought that would be furious if I tell you. Now, since he is turned on by the accoutrements of femininity, he's very angry that feminists are critical of it. He states that feminists misunderstand femininity. Even many feminists buy into traditionally sexist notions about femininity, which is that femininity is a problem. That's a sexist notion. That it is artificial, contrived, and frivolous, yes. He says that it's not true that femininity is subordinate to masculinity, it's not artificial, it's not performance. Certain aspects of femininity as well as masculinity are natural and proceed, socialization and supersede biological sex. And the job of feminism, according to him, is to empower femininity. Right? He does it, he's got it. Feminism is about empowering him to represent it. Yes, we've got to be, no form of gender equality can ever truly be achieved until we first worked to empower femininity itself. I can see there's a lot of women in this room who aren't involved in that. Shame on you. I think I do need to stop now. Transgender activists such as have developed a new vocabulary, which you will all be very aware of, to advance their political agenda and turn feminism upside down. One of these new terms is cis, which they apply to all those who are it becomes a swear word in itself. Yeah. And it turns out to me that women whom feminists see as oppressed by men are now actually men's oppressors. So it's been completely turned around. Cis women oppress men. And the men represent feminism and they're fighting for femininity. It's the most extraordinary, as Mary Daly would say, patriarchal reversal. So women, probably like those in this room, have cis privilege over and engage in cis-sexism towards men who are transgender. Statements or behaviours that offend men who are transgender, such as political criticism or lack of enthusiasm on the part of lesbians for relationships with ladies, are labelled transphobia or transmisogyny. Everybody knows what lady sticks are, yes? It's what transgenders call the penises, which these men generally retain because sexual excitement is more difficult if they have them removed, so they just give them a change in vocabulary. Okay, so historical analysis is crucial to understanding where transgenderism came from. It's not a transhistorical and essential condition. Though cross-dressing has existed historically amongst lesbians and gay men, heterosexual male cross-dressers and some women who dressed as men so that they could earn more money and go to sea, serve in the military. The idea of an essential condition in which a person could be possessed of the brain of one sex and the body of another is a recent invention, historically. My idea of what is recent in history, since I'm actually a historian, is probably not the same as yours. I'm thinking 19th century. So it's a recent invention, and through the ideas of sexologists like Ellis, and the development of medical specialisms which enable the body to change, such as endocrinology, plastic surgery, and anesthesia. Transgenderism is invention that supports male domination and maintains the rigid sex stereotypes that provide the scaffolding of male power. It was constructed and continues to be supported by a male-dominated medical and pharmaceutical industry devoted to maintaining the heterosexual and correctly gendered status quo against the inroads of feminism. Is that working? Yeah.
It's working now. Okay, Sheila, well that was all very boring. I don't think we have any questions whatsoever. I think they were all asleep through that. So we've got time. We can run a little bit into the break. So we'll take sort of between 5 to 10 minutes now with a few questions. Have we got the roving mics around? If you keep your questions fairly brief, please.
Yeah, it was just a brief question about what was your opinion on the relationship between transgenderism and neoliberalism?
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Transgenderism and what?
Neoliberalism. So it seems to be mostly, sadly, my generation of feminists that seem to be working on a completely different definition of gender and sex than everybody else. About the individualism and the idea that gender isn't something that's imposed on you, but it is something that you feel individually as individual persons. And I think that has a relationship with neoliberalism, and I wanted you to see what you think about it.
Yes, I think transgenderism, as we presently understand it, is an invention of the US, there's no doubt about that, which is the heartland of the construction of neoliberalism, which is indeed based on a form of individualism, which constructs the idea of identity. Identity couldn't matter and wouldn't be intelligible in many communities and countries in the world where there are different kinds of versions. And we may not like some of those because they're to family and other things. But identity, as it was constructed through therapy and neoliberal ideology in the US, is something very specific. You have to have the idea of identity before you can have gender identity disorder and the sort of problems we've now seen arising. But I think also transgenderism connected obviously to capitalism in the sense of the extraordinary profits that have been made by the drugs industry and by all of these specialist therapists and so on who are setting themselves up to deal with this problem and making money out of this problem. And that's a very serious difficulty in itself. And the fact is that anybody who doesn't wish to be pushed into transgenderism really cannot find, without enormous difficulty, any psychiatrist or therapist today who would dare to take a different view and and actually help their children or help those individuals to actually not go down this path. So we're in terrible contagion in the psychiatric professions, which are part of sexology. But the fact is there was more questioning in the 70s than there is now. We're in a bad space now.
Thanks. And then, if we can get the mic back.
Hi, I'm really new to all of this, so thank you very much. It was really illuminating. I've only looked into this a very, very tiny bit, but I was looking at some studies around brain sizes, and there were, the people that say that they were, like the men that say they were born as women, that they always felt like they were just trapped in the wrong body.
I wonder if you could move the mic a bit. I can't hear it very well.
Sorry. I'll just start again. So I'm brand new to all of this, and I'm very, very interested in this, so thank you for your talk, it's very illuminating. The stuff that I have looked at looks at like brain studies, and looks at the men that say that they have been born in the wrong body, and that they've always felt that they were just born in the wrong body, just trapped in the wrong body. And in those studies, they look at the brain. I don't know what it is exactly, but like how women and men's brains are different, and those men had sort of more similar brains to women. And I was just wondering, you have obviously looked at this in much more detail. Like, what are your thoughts on like the brain studies, basically?
Yeah, I think that feminists have always been rather critical of this idea that there is a feminine brain, because we've always been into things like changing tyre wheels and putting our hands in our pockets and so on, which are terribly naughty things for women, and those are supposed to be feminine to do. So I would think it's fair to say we have never accepted there are feminine brains, which mean that we can't be plumbers or whatever. So we've never accepted that stuff. Transgenders, of course, have raised this idea again, transgender activists, and if you look at there were studies on the gay brain back in the 90s, an attempt to say that homosexuality was about the gay brain. I think it was one person who said that. I mean, generally, homosexuality itself was understood to be socially constructed in gay liberation times itself, because it's the construction of a particular identity around what is just a form of behaviour towards persons that one might love. So, brain science is very, very conservative. I mean, there's brain science from the 1960s that said black people had brains that meant that they were inferior and couldn't do certain things, and women couldn't do certain things as well. I think I'm not an expert, and I'm not going to do all the biological brain stuff. It should be said that in terms of AIDS, for instance, and AIDS drugs, or in terms of, of hormonal drugs, they potentially can change things that are happening in the brain, and if people do research on what's happening to the brain of transgenders taking us down the track, they might find something slightly different. I don't know. I am not an expert in any of that, and I don't really care what size people's brains are. I don't think it makes them like frilly knickers. I really, really
Yep, go ahead.
My brother is a very senior genetic scientist who was drunk from the Kool-Aid of his daughter, who is, at York University and believes all of this lady brain stuff. And I'm wondering, how do we get it? I've argued with him, and he's admitted that, well, yeah, okay, I haven't actually read up on this. Yeah, maybe you know more about it than I do. How do we get the word out that this is all just literally bollocks? And also, can I just say, low swinging bollocks at that. And the other thing is, brains are plastic. People aren't born to be taxi drivers. Their brains change when they do that training. They do not have that shape of brain before they start that training, so all of this.
I mean, carrying a handbag could actually do something to the brain. I think that's perfectly possible.
That's something to my shoulders.
Yeah. I don't really want to get into this and that about the brain. As I said before, there's no evidence that whatever's going on in the brain affects behaviour or makes people more feminine or more masculine or good at this or good at that. No evidence for that. There's some very good feminist studies to prove that, and we can direct you to all of them. So what I want to look at formations in the brain to understand why somebody likes handbags or knickers, I don't know.
Okay.
I had just two very brief questions. Conforming to the male stereotype, is there anything...
I'm really having trouble with the sound.
Can you hold it down?
I can virtually not hear it.
Yeah.
Further away or closer?
I think slightly
No, further away.
Further away.
Project your voice a little bit.
Okay. Yes, I male stereotype. It's less common, but there are women who believe themselves to be men, and so it happens the other way around. What would you say in terms of patriarchy and male being the superior class, and is fetishization going on there? And obviously it's more difficult to construct male genitalia. This is my understanding of them. So there's that. The other question is, part of the problem of disputing the rubbish is that it seems to me a lot of the leading voices in the psychiatric profession saying this is all nonsense are predominantly Catholics or evangelical Christians. Now, it used to be okay back in the day for joint cause to happen on that level. That seems to me it's more difficult now. What would your comment be on the problem that at least it's in the interests of the transgender community to promote this idea that the only people who are disputing this are kind of right-wing fundamentalist Christians?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the first question? I've got the second one.
About female to males.
Oh, yeah.
And how that relates to fetishization, class.
Got you.
The construction of transgenderism mostly comes from men. Men in the psychiatric profession, male demanders, whether they're homosexual or heterosexual. Women, transgendering didn't really exist in the 1970s when I became a lesbian, and it wasn't there, wasn't happening. So it is overwhelmingly male. What we have now, and I think that Stephanie may talk about this later on, is huge numbers of young girls seeking to transgender because they cannot bear the idea of becoming girls and growing up to be women, because that status is so revolting. The sort of underwear, the sexualization, the pornography, and so on makes it so unattractive. They are desperate not to be girls. Because we are in a very backward time now. It's not unisex, get rid of Janet and John books. It's going back to really terrible sexualized feminine behaviours for girls. So young girls have very good reason to reject it, and of course male is a higher status, and it's much safer for them physically to be male. Otherwise, in terms of women transgendering, the overwhelming majority of those who do so have had relationships with women and identified as lesbians before they did so, and before they identified as men. But for women, so in other words, they are seeking to exit the despised category lesbian, which unfortunately right now is totally despised. It's almost impossible to even say the word now. You have to say non-binary or weird things like that instead of lesbian. There's no lesbian pride anymore, which is kind of extraordinary. Can we all say it? Lesbian! God, how wonderful to hear that sound. So I think that's one reason that lesbians are transgender, but also it's not about sexual excitement for them. Lesbians don't transgender because they imagine themselves to be a man in a woman's body and are excited by the underwear. It's hard to be excited by the underwear. What it is for them, okay? But it's totally different for the women, and it's mainly about the oppression of women as lesbians that this construction and this practice is happening now. And the other one
about the right-wing Christian.
Oh yes. Now this is a problem. The fact is, having been involved in the anti-pornography struggle and anti-reproductive surrogacy struggle, for instance, I'm very aware that Catholics and Christians have sometimes got points of connections with what I'm doing. Often very different ideas, but some points of connection. And I sometimes think it's because they haven't bought all the postmodern queer theory stuff about how the body doesn't matter. They do think the body matters. Feminists think the body matters in pornography and sexual violence and transgenderism and reproductive surrogacy and so on. So that kind of point of connection is the reality of the body is, I think, what makes the connection across. What one should do in terms of whether or not one works with them and sits on the same panel and so on, I think it's an open question at the moment, you know, and it's a very tricky question within feminism and requires more discussion. But I think we do need to make some kind of alliances on this issue of some kind. I prefer gay men to be coming forward, to be honest with you, but that's not really happening.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. I'm aware there were other people with questions. We're going to have to leave it there because otherwise we'll really start to overrun. So if you have questions, there will be time in the later sessions as well. So if you can save your questions, I'm sure you'll have a chance later on. We're going to wrap that session up now. We've got 25 minutes for the break. There's tea, coffee and biscuits outside. I would just say before we start running, just watch the camera there, don't trip over any wires or anything. I'll see you back here at 11:30, but we just said thank you again to Sheila.